Hi, and welcome to this conversation series called Navigating the Present, in which we get to know various artists and their exciting practices, and discuss art, courage, precariousness, and some of the challenging situations we are currently facing globally, such as the climate crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and social inequity. The series is produced by the Romanian Cultural Institute in Stockholm, with technical support by Cosmin Titsa and moderated by me. I'm Sara Rossling, and I'm happy to have the artist Larisa Crunţeanu as guest in this second episode, and whose video No Image, No Camouflage we just saw a small excerpt from. And we will come back to that. So warmly welcome, Larisa. Nice to see you. Hi.
Nice to see you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And before introducing you properly, I want to mention for those watching that this talk will be recorded and that it will last for about an hour. And at the end of the conversation, there is a possibility for the audience to pose questions by writing comments and questions in the live stream feed. So feel free to write them at any time, and we'll take them at the end. So let me introduce Larisa Crunţeanu, who is an interdisciplinary artist working between research, speculation, and entertainment. She holds a BA in journalism, an MA in photography and moving image, and a PhD in visual arts that she finished last year at the National University of Arts in Bucharest. Her practice as performer, video artist, and sound collector moves from reality to fiction in an endless conversation with the viewer. Her works create contexts in which facts, memories are reactivated, encouraging a shared effort and the emergence of new practices. Many of her projects reflect on the notion of collaboration and the ideas existing behind objects and stories, which we will hear more about tonight. Larisa Crunţeanu works take shape as video, performances, sound works, text-based objects, text-based works and installations, often involving textiles and architectural aspects. And recent shows include, amongst all, the solo exhibition Do It by Heart at the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Bucharest, that was up until January this year, and the group exhibition Milk Me Sugar at Galeria Arsenal in Białystok in Poland. You have to excuse my pronunciation. Also this year. The title of today's conversation, if I could have said it with words, somehow referring to your interest in language and voice. And to me, at the same time, it points to other forms of expressions beyond the spoken language. Can you begin with saying a few words about your about what language means to you and your practice?
So the title of this conversation appeared actually in a conversation between the two of us, and I think it's actually a part of a longer statement that was something like, if I could have said it with words, I would have written or spoken about it. That doesn't mean that there are things we cannot talk about, but maybe verbal language is not the only way to address those questions or subjects, even when they are highly discursive. And maybe it would make sense if I start with explaining a bit what the video excerpt that was playing before our conversation was about, which is called No Image, No Camouflage. So No Image, No Camouflage is a work that I made in 2018 that is based on a visual language where an act of disappearance, or let's say extraction of image, creates the subject of the video. So the silhouette that we see in this apparently untouched landscape, untouched by the human landscape, is actually filled in with a pattern that is the copyright property of Adobe. And this has become a sort of universal language. This is how we recognize the lack of an image in image editing softwares by this company. So for me, it was very interesting to work with this concept of on one side, the camouflage, but then the camouflage as a way of, as a bridge between, let's say, the cultural and the natural. Maybe, and in a way, this work, I think, is a reflection of this idea that the landscape can be something that an animal in pursuit of camouflage is always aware of, is something that only, that we cannot ever completely extract ourselves from. There's this beautiful text called Mimetism and Asthenia by Roger Calois, where he says that camouflage is a seduction of the background, you know. So in this sense, the background is not just this idyllic landscape. The background is a digital imagery that we see on our computer. So in order to talk about this, I have chosen a specific visual language to address it, where the visual language is composed both from these elements that I was talking about, but also from the way the whole setup of the camera, the way the camera is being set up, in the sense of, like, it's imitating wildlife documentary up until a certain point. So it's still, if you wish, it's still language, but it's not verbal.
You are the performer in the video as well, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I'm the performer in the video. In this sense, I guess the video also pushes forward questions of how do we illustrate the not only the body, but also the female body, or how do we illustrate a sort of how can I illustrate a sort of friction between the image of the body that is always subjected to pre-existing ideas when it comes to race and gender and social class, and the image of nature as that thing which, in, let's say, post-anthropogenic thinking, we cannot separate anymore from human intervention or the human gaze.
It also makes me think of what it means to be replaceable somehow, and the boundaries between natural and artificial, perhaps, when I see this checkered figure against the rural landscape. In what way do you approach or reflect upon the intersection of natural, or so-called natural, and artificial in your work?
Well, we are, how can I say it? Like, we are, the body is an agential field. It is both this concept of the body and the landscape, I think, should be understood more in the sense of discursive fields that create certain, that manifest in a material manner. as I was saying, I think it's even like I can only work or show work from a specific position that has a history, and that is the one of a woman making art, So in this sense, I think this work talks a lot about also the difficulty that we find ourselves in these times of post-feminist, post-identitarian thinking, where if there is no universal concept of a woman to address, then the only thing that is still universal in addressing this type of subject is a loss, is a lack of a collective identity. So hence also the title, No Image, No Camouflage.
Thank you. And speaking about language and voice and sound, which you work with both in a literal and a symbolic sense, or symbolically, you often use your own voice in various works, such as reading words out loud, singing a pop song, or as a character uttering lines in a fictional play. The first work that we saw from you now was a work without sound, but you do work with sound a lot and voice. And where does this interest in voice come from? And what are your thoughts on voice in relation? You spoke a bit about it, but relation to political agency and the subjects, objects, and materials existing behind the voices.
Well, where does it come from? I think if we look at it, let's say biographically, I have musical training and classical canto training, and I've also worked as a primary school teacher and as a journalist, where the voice is, and these have kind of shaped an understanding of voice not only as a tool of expression, but in a very extended idea of institutions, where institution is that which, let's say, pushes forward political violence, then just like family and education and medical and the medical system, language is also an institution that we keep on creating collectively. And it's also one of the hardest to avoid cultural indicators of our identity. So wherever you go on the globe and you ask where does the bad language is being spoken in terms of accents and intonation or slang or so on, it's going to be at the margins, whether we talk about social, racial, religious margins. So and there's this concept of switching in language. And it has to do both with how we use in verbal communication sounds like phonology, but it also has to do with the vocabulary that we have access to. So in this sense, I think I'm always trying to, or not always, but my interest in voice comes from it being both a tool, but also as I was saying, an institution that we cannot escape and that keeps actualizing collectively through usage. So if we look, for example, at these, as I was saying, marginalized communities, code switching within the language means that these individuals from a very young age, they will have to emulate a language that is not available for them at home. So in order to just to be at the same level of learning, accessing information like other peers. So even in our conversation now, I am at the same time communicating my ideas, but also restating a certain locality, that I belong to a certain education, that I had access to a certain identity in terms of gender and so on.
And also skill in adapting the language to some
Exactly.
extent. Yeah.
Exactly. So we're also back to camouflage in this
exactly.
sense, you know. Yeah. I think maybe I could also show a work that is that comes from the intersection of these themes, and that is called Esprit de Corps, which in a literal meaning could be translated as the spirit of the body. But actually, the term is also used in military and corporate contexts to indicate the degree of coalization, or how fast a group of individuals who do not know each other, who have been brought together by a shared agenda or scope, can become a collective body. So the better the spirit of the body, esprit de corps, the better the chances of this group to act as a unity. And the title of the work comes from the origin of the objects that I have used in this installation. Sorry, I dropped something. So maybe I could share. You should see a folder now, right?
Yes. We see the folder.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these are installation views of this work. Just a second. I hope this is big enough. In 2015, I was working with Sonia Hornung, a good friend and collaborator, on a project in Bucharest. And while walking on this boulevard between the Palace of the Parliament House, the infamous huge building built by Ceausescu to host the parliament nowadays, and another big square, we observed a bizarre object hiding in plain sight, which was a speaker that was camouflaged as a rock. And it was silent. And we came back sometime later to see if it was working. And again, it was silent. And the bizarre object would appear in spring and disappear in autumn. So after Sonia left Bucharest, we started emailing each other about what this silent, hidden rock that was actually a speaker in front of the Parliament Palace could say, what kind of messages need to be hidden in the public space and so on. And after some time, Sonia started another project, and she said, she left me to my devices with this rock. And I started again to make inquiries about its origins. So I started to write to the mayor's office and to all sorts of institutions that could tell me something about it. And I found out that this bizarre object was actually part of a series that were hidden on this boulevard. And the project on paper consisted of a music program that should project on these speakers folkloric music 1 hour a day for the entertainment and the encouragement of nationalist a feeling of the passerbyers. So for me, this idea was more hinting to sonic terror than nationalist feelings encouragement. But it kind of like that's when I knew what I want to do with this object. So I found out what object this was and who was the producer. It was in Taiwan, and I wrote to them that I would like more of these
speakers,
fake rocks. Funnily enough, what I got was on paper, like technically the same object, but it had a slightly different shape. And when I inquired about that, they told me that they have improved the shape of the rock. And this was also extremely lovely, the idea that there is an ideal rock shape that we can, work towards. But it also gave, I think, in my own eyes, it gave this object a more personal. It animated it even more. This object. So this choir of rocks, as I like to call it, is now a sound installation that mixes what is called what could be described as soft sounds, so field recordings or natural sounds, with quotes from spoken words, which are quotes from political documents, philosophy, literature, and so on. All the voices are mine, and actually all these natural soft sounds are also digitally recreated, and the sound design of the piece was realized by a close friend and very talented collaborator, Laurențiu Coțac. And
were you also addressing the public, so to say, as these speakers did initially with the folklore music, or were you also thinking about it in a public sense, like a counter?
The way the work is installed invites for the audience to stay in the middle. And in the last exhibition, we even put this nice carpet. So a lot of kids were playing and literally standing on the floor, which is looking at how Bucharest and like the public space in Bucharest looks like nowadays. I think a way friendlier approach than what is available in the public space. But to answer your question, the original objects, I have seen them time and again, but I have never listened to them. So they are always installed. So somebody has a running maintenance contract, but they never run these sounds that they are on paper supposed to. And I'm quite grateful for that, to be honest, because I like to walk in that area and I don't think that's a good idea. So if, I could play a bit of a small sound excerpt from this installation. So please keep in mind that this is what we're listening to is a field recording and not the actual sound that goes through them, because this is like a spatially distributed installation, which means it's on multiple channels and you hear everything, like the sound surrounds you when you listen to it inside the work.
I think you have to raise the volume.
You can't hear it?
Very low.
Okay, I can just put the sound. Is it better?
It's quite low, but it's...
I can also send it to you, maybe to put it just as a comment to our conversation, because it's online on my SoundCloud, the whole sound piece. So if anybody wants to listen to that, maybe it makes more sense.
Yeah, let's share it after the conversation.
Okay.
I'm thinking a bit about, I mean, it's your background working as a journalist, and I'm curious to know what you have brought with you from working as a journalist, in how you have handled or how you decipher language in a way. If you have brought with you any ways of working or methods or ways of seeing into your art history.
Well, there is this basic principle that not only that you have to check your facts, but that you constantly have to, which is very important still in the arts, even when you choose to depart from them, you have to know what you depart from. But there's also, I think, a sort of not realization, but more like consciousness or something that is in the back of my mind that both like truth and reality are something that are things that do not exist in an objective manner, but that they have to be time and again tested and actualized through language, and like the access that we have to this language and the way we project a certain reality through it is always visible, and we're always responsible for it. And I think this is, which sometimes I think helps me in the work as an artist, but also makes me maybe a bit difficult to work with, because I'm always paying attention to the words that are being used by everyone involved in a project. So I'm going to be I'm going to be a bit of a terrorist with my hosts or people doing the communication, always paying attention to this is not the right word, or you have to be careful with what you're doing with words.
I'm also thinking how you scrutinize the society somehow as a journalist, and some art practices also have similar ways of looking at society, and even though it's not just about scrutinizing, but yeah,
I mean,
when you found those, I'm thinking of when you found those rocks and were thinking of them, it could also be a scope for a journalist or something to dig deeper into.
Well, it's also, I think, there's this joke in that you would learn in journalist school that a dog biting a man is not news. A man biting a dog is news. So it's a way of underlining how perspective is that which creates interest towards a certain phenomena. So talking about how there are how the state apparatus has devices for communication or surveillance, I think is no news by now.
No.
Imagining what the perspective of that surveillance is, what it could be saying if it woke up in, you know, a post-apocalyptic reality, that's interesting. That's not news, that's art in this case. But, you know, that is something that can bring attention into the larger issue at hand. What is the state doing with our money against ourselves? So, yeah.
We have spoken a lot about language, but I'm still interested in thinking about it. And from one perspective, language can be seen as a form of logic grid, from my perspective, and for us to understand and use. And also then that it includes images and visual culture too, as a non-verbal language, as we spoke about earlier. And those are kind of formats that we recognize, such as TV commercials, for instance, or a film, etc. And I know you have a particular interest in what you call cultural protocols or stereotypes within culture. Can you describe these formats and say something about such cultural protocols and how they are contemplated and employed within your practice?
So, I mean, maybe we should first define what we refer to as cultural protocols. I think in a previous conversation that we had, it was something like those already established forms of communicating something within a cultural field that already led to the formation of a specific behavior around them. And I think this is important to mention because, as I was saying regarding the first work, I think you always have to be aware of not only of what you're trying to show, what piece of, let's say, reality you're trying to illustrate, but also of the context in which this will be shown. And this is always at play also when it comes to linguistics. It's actually a field in linguistics that is called pragmatics. How adequate is your message in the larger context where you address something? So in this sense, I find it very interesting to be, but also very, I'm very happy and very, I think I'm very lucky to be doing this work in a field that has the appearance of a great deal of freedom when it comes to protocols, but actually can and that actually at the same time, paradoxically, can be very strict when it comes to what belongs to the art world and what is outside of it. So
defining what an artwork and defining a film and
exactly
and the border between that.
So in this sense, like, and I think this comes from especially the playing with TV formats, or the interest around TV formats started some time ago on the occasion of a project that I was curating. And the project was called the Telenational Dream, and it was the first project that I made when I moved to Warsaw in Poland, and in that instance, I was putting together works that dealt with television formats or television as a subject in an attempt at kind of illustrating how television as a tool is part of the construction of the idea of nation, and how nation is this sort of imagined community that is being sustained and reinforced through certain tools. and one of them being television. So at the time, I chose to promote the project by imitating a commercial. And then this became a sort of tradition. So time and again, I would have shows that that are introduced as little jingles or commercials. But
I'm thinking also about the project that you brought up earlier with Sonia about the Apoca textile factory in Bucharest.
Yeah,
and which was once one of southeastern Europe's most prominent textile factories. It doesn't exist anymore, and it operated from 1948 and with only female employees. And in this work, you kind of combine both sound and voice and investigate femininity and labor on a societal and political level. And you gave voice to a sort of ghost from a female ghost from the factory. But you also broadcasted, or you created a piece of that research that you broadcasted on national TV. So I'm curious in how do you combine these cultural protocols and the kind of stories behind the narratives? How do you combine those and find your way of working?
So in the case of this specific research that and art production, let's say, process that I was engaged with Sonia Hornung, we interviewed a lot of workers from this factory that in a privatized manner, fragmented manner, still they still work within the industry, even though the Apoca factory does not exist per se anymore. So we realized that there was a lot of prejudice around them and around the factory that was dating far back historically, and which does not exist only in Romania. Wherever there are let's say practices or places where a lot of women come together, whether they are girls' schools or nuns, there are these myths of hysteria or promiscuity or something like that. So while we were working about this and how and while we were investigating how the media contributed to creating this myth around them and calling grown-up women always the Apoca girls within the reportage and so on, their reporting, we were approached by a TV station ourselves to talk about the project that we're doing. So we were kind of faced with this challenge of how do we respond to this, let's say, manipulation of image and production of myth. So we chose, instead of explaining ourselves what we're doing, we chose to launch another myth about what's happening around. And the TV station kind of bought the bait, and we ended up doing a work by proxy. So they got to decide. So the result in the end is ours as much as it's theirs. The way they chose to
contribute it,
the myth that we gave back. And maybe I could show this. And it
please do. Is the sound on? Yeah.
Zilnic orașul înlung și înlat. De prea puține ori însă suntem curioși să aflăm povestea unui cartier, a unei străzi sau a unei clădiri. Și mai puțin curioși suntem să aflăm istorii legate de un spațiu gol, abandonat, din lipsa de timp, de interes sau din teamă. Rossling și Larisa Crunțeanu sunt artiști vizuali și inițiatoarele unui proiect mai puțin convențional. Cele două au pornit de la istoria fabricii de textile Apoca, după privatizarea din anul 1992, și au pus cap la cap toate informațiile adunate din presă sau de la foste angajate ale fabricii, totul cu scopul de a afla adevărul despre Apoca. Rezultatul a fost uimitor. Un spațiu care nu mai promitea nimic a devenit, de fapt, o sursă inepuizabilă de povești.
I suppose it's a question of, firstly, urban wastelands are always sites of speculation, often of real estate speculation, but also of myths and legends and rumors that are floating around these spaces, stories that are attached to the sites.
Un spațiu abandonat nu e un spațiu liber, nu e un spațiu gol, nu e lipsit de conținut. Peste el s-au așezat diverse leere, straturi de, realități sociale, politice, economice, etc. Și în acest moment este un strat care permite niște interacțiuni, ca să zic așa, mai libere. Adică fiecare spațiu abandonat, cred că atrage atenția asupra unor necesități care există în zonă.
Proiecte asemănătoare există și în alte țări, spune Sonia. De altfel, australianca stabilită la Berlin a fost deja implicată în programe care susțin ideea că un spațiu dezafectat poate deveni un micro-oraș. În proiectul inițiat la București, centrul de interes nu a fost spațiul părăsit în sine, ci povestea care i-a urmat.
The history of the textiles factory Apoca is also a history of women's labour, and of women's labour that has been hidden in a particular way or used by the media or by the politicians in a particular way. And so this has been, I guess, a question for us. How do you extract or find out how it really is, how conditions really were during the communist period and also during the period of privatisation?
Programul Agenței Speculației a plecat de la premisa că, dincolo de falimentul unei industrii altădată prospere, sunt mii de povești ale unor femei rămase peste noapte, fără loc de muncă. Povești despre care nimeni nu a vorbit vreodată. În schimb, postelor angajate li s-a pus un stigmat deloc mărmuritor. Fetele de la Apoca.
De ce sunt fete, sărmanele femei, că sunt femei mature în toată firea, și de unde vine și ce fel de relație instaurează o astfel de denumire.
I guess we all know this story about not wanting foreign currency, not wanting canned cigarettes, we just want to petre roman, And I guess this story has been used and produced a particular media image of the workers of Apoca, which may or may not correspond to the reality.
De la adevărul istoric, la legendele și miturile urbane construite în jurul statutului de muncitoare la Apoca, este un drum lung. Pentru Sonia și Larisa, tocmai aceasta este miza. Să traseze limita dintre realitate și ficțiune.
The thing is that the wasteland we're talking about is called Apoca, but actually it's the site of a different factory. It was originally a munitions factory that was demolished in 2009. And so we began by approaching the florist who works on the corner of the intersection of this factory. He told us that he has had this strange feeling about this place over the last 5 years since the factory was demolished. And the reason is because he gets this sense he can hear the dogs howling in the morning, and amidst the sound of these howling dogs, sometimes he can hear a woman crying. And so we were asking ourselves, what is this? What is this woman crying? And we went across the road and we interviewed the women who are working at the bakery across the road, and they told us that in the morning, they have on 2 occasions, separate occasions, seen a ghost walking across the rubble.
Nu vreau să merg neapărat într-un spiritualism din ăsta exacerbat, că locul este bântuit, dar există o anumită prezență și cred că ceea ce este foarte important în proiectul ăsta, pe toate aceste straturi despre care vorbeam, economic, politic, social, etc., este faptul că de fiecare dată lucrurile astea se întâmplă cu costul unor vieți reale. Adică oamenii, cei mai de jos, muncitorii, sunt cei care plătesc pentru fiecare nouă etapă, pentru fiecare nouă idee sau mișcare de capital, de material, de ideologie.
Povestea fantomei misterioase a pornit de la o situație reală. Odată cu privatizarea Apoca, mii de femei au rămas fără loc de muncă. Este și povestea Anei.
This is a site for research in a common project that we're doing, And during this research, we found out about the story of a woman who was working in one of the companies which developed from what was known as Apoca or interdisciplinary. Before 89, and during the privatization in the beginning of the 90s, a lot of the women working in these textile factories became unemployed, and this woman specifically, we only know that her name is Anna. She lost her job, and she didn't have no family, and somehow found refuge here, and she was living here. She became a homeless person.
Proiectul Agenței Speculației în spații părăsite, uitate, explorează o poveste cu foarte multe straturi, spun cele două artiste. Important în acest demers este să găsești firul care leagă întreaga istorie. În cazul de față, povestea Anei este cea care poate să rescrie alte mii de povești ale celor pe care societatea le-a numit, pe scurt, fetele de la Apoca.
Thank you. And this feminist perspective, I mean, it runs through your practice and work, and you have addressed this in other works too, right?
Yes. And I mean, as I've said it, I think before, I can only work from a certain position and identity, and pretending that there is a certain objective position from which I could work is just not within the possibilities, the spectrum of possibilities for me. And I think in the same, let's say, range or way of approaching this identity as a grid of understanding reality is another work that we were thinking of showing, if we're still okay with the time, which is a room full of hysterical women. So in as I was saying, you know, this idea that groups of women or female characters behaving emotionally in a certain way have been historically have led historically to a dismissal of their discourse, or is something that I'm interested into. And when we talk about hysteria, this has been understood as a sort of somatic manifestation where language is that which is not, or discourse is that which is not, we should be looking at, but we should find the if you wish, the cause of that manifestation. So
also from institutions' perspective, I mean, these are images that institutions has brought forward, and narratives about women.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So in 2019, I was the gallery that I'm working with, and I'm represented by Anca Poterașu Gallery, proposed that we do a sort of solo show or solo booth at an art fair, and that prompted me to produce a work that deals directly with this idea. And the work is called Room Full of Hysterical Women, and it shows, and it's a way of creating several portraits to several actually fictional characters from literature that have, within the narrative or outside of it, been labeled as hysterical. Are you still seeing my screen?
No, not yet.
Okay. So this is a view of the installation at Savvy Contemporary in Berlin, where I showed the work in their previous location. Their floors were not very straight, as you can see. And each of these characters is represented by a triptych that resembles this paravan or this screen that people change behind, which belong both to the domestic environment, but also to the clinical environment. And each character is illustrated, has the words at the center, and is illustrated through a quote, a suggestion of the costume that the character might be wearing, and also a blueprint of the space where the character is at that moment. So in the image that we see is a character from Wild Seed by Octavia Butler, and she's actually on a slave ship when this dialogue happens, and it's the only character in the series until now that is not in, let's say, in a home. This is a close-up, and the print is made. It's like silk screening, but with an ink that is based on cement. So this was also a way of. This is the view from Artissima. But this is also a way of, suggesting this idea of weight and timelessness that we perceive when it comes to institutions or the edifice, as opposed to these fleeting moments of, this emotional fleeting moment of female character speaking her mind and soul. Yeah, and these are close-ups. So in this case, it's a character that is a teenager. So what we see is a blueprint of a school from the States from that era. So it also took a lot of research to do this first series. We have 7 characters by now, but I plan on expanding it. And I mean, I'm lucky to have a lot to choose from, but it's also very sad to think that this series could extend to include hundreds of characters and still not exhaust all the possibilities. Yeah. Should we move on?
Yes.
Sure.
So I know you have also some other works to show that are more spatial somehow and draw on the architectural structures that I'm interested in seeing and talking about. And in relation to how you work with your interest in performativity and institutions and architecture and the feminine gaze, and so to say, and how you work with creating these structures.
I mean, the work that we saw actually is, let's say, started as a splinter from a wider research into the intersection of 2 very improbable languages again. So on one side, the architectural language understood as highly intellectual, very well socially regarded, historically performed by men, kind of language and also way of imagining the world or the society. And on the other side, the cutting pattern as a sort of language that is related to soft materials, to the textile, that has not been a form of art, that has been a part of the domestic, the vernacular, and it has been historically performed on the level of day-to-day life by women.
And also art history somehow.
Exactly.
I mean, yeah.
And so although they have such different histories and social statuses, the two are essentially very similar. They are bidimensional ways that anticipate volumes and the way volumes in which human bodies appear and interact. So part of this research, where I was working with a dear friend, architect Magda Vieriu, and a textile expert Ekaterina Guzun, and a designer Juliana Mashko, we were going through this, let's say, theoretical and image-based research, and at some point we realized that we need to kind of base our research or meet physically, because I wasn't living in Romania at the time, within a specific context. So we started looking for a building where we could first of all work, but where our research could also find a bit more its specificity. So the brief was quite simple, but it proved to be quite difficult to satisfy, in the sense that we were looking for a building that had that was still standing, and would still and a building that was built for a certain specific role in terms of audience and the relationship to authority. And that building proved to be Sala Omnia, which is a historical building commissioned by the Romanian Communist Party ruler Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej, to serve as the headquarters for the Communist Party diplomatic meetings and diplomatic spectacles. So a place where power could stage itself through discourse and live performative arts. And fortunately, the building at the time of the research was in the administration of the National Dance Center, and was still accessible, even though not for the public. Now the building is going through a renovation, and it will become the National Dance Center. So once we kind of moved there and started working there, the research became more grounded, and we came up with a large-scale installation that that's quite labyrinthic, where we tried to adapt in cutting patterns certain architectural elements from the building, and we chose to work with those elements that are most probable to disappear in the transformation of the building. So again, let's say there was an interest in minor forms or minor histories within a certain bigger structure that we perceive as being timeless, or the edifice. And
shall we have a look while you're speaking, if you can show some images?
So this was, sorry.
No.
So this is the installation within, like in a first installing in the building.
In the actual building.
Yeah, in the actual building. And so the structure is made of metal and textile, and the metal kind of works with the bigger forms of the building, which are most probably going to stay, like the shape of the staircase, like the arcs of the windows, and so on. And then the textiles, which have interventions in print, but also cutouts from textile, imitate certain elements from interior architecture. and we try to display them as if they would be displayed, let's say, on a piece of paper, on a cutting pattern paper. And also what's interesting in this intersection of two languages is the fact that they refer to the human body. Like, while architecture is always defined in relation to, let's say, a universal body, whether we're talking about Da Vinci's Man or Corbusier's Modulor, design for clothes and cutting patterns are always, even the most simple, the simplest ones are always bearing a couple of measures. They are always there to be adapted. So the work was first installed in the actual historical building. Then it moved to Leipzig in a very interesting context. It's an art space that is part of an industrial complex, and they do have an exhibition room. But when I arrived there with this work, I said, I want to show it within the actual working space. So it was in this huge halle where they are, where this company was putting together train wagons and metros and subways and so on. So it was really lovely. It was really lovely to have it there. And then more recently, the work was in the museum in a sort of hybrid exhibition, something between a solo show and a group show, in the sense that I took the occasion, I kind of, seen it as an opportunity to bring along a couple of friends and collaborators who proposed works that kind of dealt like in relation to the themes that I was approaching. Ideally, this would have been live works, because my proposal was that we would use this large installation as a sort of background or scenography. But the COVID pandemics made it that we had to adapt online or mediated formats that did not require a live audience.
So we haven't really brought up your practice-based PhD yet, and we're actually over an hour now, but I still think it's interesting. And because we have been talking about public spaces and institutions and so on, and the PhD was investigating questions around, and now I quote, the possibility of a collective intellect or acts of collective manifestation that escape a clear political agenda, which can host genuine manifestations and the trans individual in the sphere of art through collaborative practice. So can you, perhaps it's too much to ask for, but can you describe briefly in what way you are exploring this collective intellect and the collective manifestations? And how does that hang together with the work we have seen?
So the theme of my, or the research behind my PhD starts from the concept of individuation in the philosophy of Gilbert Simondon, and then in its, let's say, more actualized and socially and politically grounded interpretations of Paulo Virno and Simon Red and Ana Vujanovic and others. And this concept is basically a way of looking at the human being as something that is not a unity, that is not a monolith, and that or let me put, or if I put it differently, as something that becomes individual only on the margins of it. At the center of the being in their philosophy is not the individual, but the act of individuation. And this very simple idea proves to be actually quite complex when you look at it from the perspective of a society where there is always something bigger than us, a sort of pre-individual reality which is caught up in the process of individuation. And in our turn, we always are at work producing realities that are caught in future individuations. And of course, this has a lot of finds a lot of outlets in different philosophies, and it's also very close to Hannah Arendt's interpretation of the public space and so on. But in the context of my PhD, this was actually related to the types of work that is available in in the contemporary society, and the types of work that, or the types of relations that we create through works within the art field that could correspond to different ways of individuation and relations as defined by Simondon and the others that I mentioned. So it was also a way of putting together or creating a parallel between these philosophies, questions of artistic identity, and collaborative practices within the arts, be them direct co-authorship, collaboration, participatory practices, curatorial collaboration, and different hybrid forms of bringing together subjectivities within the art world in the scope of actually illustrating how we are always creating actually semantic fields of where the individual cannot be expressed other than as a multiplicity. I don't think there's a clear way to illustrate that in artworks, but I think that, you know, being aware of the types of audiences you produce, and openly talking about the difficulties that these questions bring within this sphere is very important. Like I was describing earlier, this show at the museum was, I still don't know very clearly what it was, because it was, I mean, if you just look at it from the material that was presented there, it was a solo show. There were big works, installations that bear this name of an artist, although all of them were made interdisciplinary with the help of different other collaborators. But then the thinking behind it came in friction with an intellectual milieu that I have nothing to do with, that have not, many of whom don't even live anymore nowadays. And then the way it was actualized, like in terms of live audience, was with the help or through the works of friends and collaborators who were not physically there. So, yeah.
And I'm thinking also of the stories behind, I mean, the workers and the subjects, and that also contributes somehow to the work with their stories. And but speaking about the current situation, that this was your almost your last the last show you did, the situation in the world due to the pandemic has intensified the lousy working conditions for artists and cultural workers, and a lot of artists have met postponed shows and payments and fewer commissions and jobs, and perhaps also higher competition and expectations on what artists should deliver. How have you dealt with this situation and navigated through this precarious situation?
Well, I was lucky enough to have planned for 2020 because of my upcoming thesis defense to be quite a silent and isolated one. But of course, it was harder to do that when there was so much uncertainty around and so much anxiety. But what happened afterwards, I think, for me was like it produced a sort of shift in the way I look at this necessity for producing and also constantly communicating what I'm producing to an audience. So I stopped, I jumped off the social media wagon, which kind of created this even more this narrative of this very negative narrative of a certain threat. If you're not online, if you're not constantly talking about what you do, you don't exist anymore. And it's paradoxical that now I'm talking about it in an online conversation on Facebook that I cannot see. So, but you know, it is what it is. But I guess in my practice, it has also made me a bit less preoccupied with where my work will be shown. So, because I always produced knowing what the context will be. At least the first show, I would know the proportions of the space. I would know if it's you know, what else is around. So this kind of put me in the shoes of somebody who is delivering upon the context. It's not to say that I don't like what I produced, and it's important to give yourself some sort of limitations, but maybe that is the key word, to give yourself some limitations and not always act upon limitations that are imposed by external forces. And it has also made me, I think, more aware to the very, to the immediate, in the sense of very small, let's say, domestic actions that I was doing. So when everything in Romania was in lockdown, I started valuing more the daily walks that I had with my partner. And because even the parks were closed, the walks were always just around our block of flats. And then I started thinking, you know, like how I started reading into cartographies and thinking about this bodily, this effect it has, the way these walks affect my body and how I can recreate these walks. So I would just lay on the floor on my back and imagine I take the walk again, you know. And I mean, I started reading about cartographies, and there's a beautiful thing that happens that was happening in Marshall Islands, which are a type of maps that are created with sticks and rocks, which are called matang, the maps. And they are maps that show not what it is, because they're maps for navigating an open sea, so the invisible, but they illustrate those things which one might encounter. So they're maps of possibilities, and not of actual events or you know, topographies that one would meet. And I'm fascinated with that, and because of that I started making some charts myself. And then I also I can show one. Wait. So this is the only one that I have here. I don't know if you're seeing it.
Perhaps you should move a bit further back. Yeah, we see it. So it's
like this, actually.
Yeah.
So this was just a first sketch for a series of works that I did, and only one of them was exhibited. And I can, maybe we can end with this. It was called Floating Anchor. And so starting from this idea of the maps that you create, that I create without necessarily imitating or following a real topography, I made this triptych again that uses a specially coated PVC material, which is which imitates a mirror, but if you're standing on one side, but you can see through it if you're standing on the other side. So it's a bit of this surveillance technology, onto which I hope this is visible, onto which I sewn a lot of the walks around the neighborhood that I had and that I just noted in my notebook. Yeah, there's more to come on this intersection of small, fragile materials and maps, but I guess.
So somehow, yeah, revisiting the locality somehow, when you're not able to travel and when you're not out working and meeting people and seeing your own neighborhood with new eyes. And
yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
But I guess it's also, you have to be courageous to, to also leave social media and somehow, and the fear of missing out. And
well, if there's still anybody watching this, please be aware that you might get tomorrow a newsletter from me saying that I'm doing this today. So I was never very good at it, I have to admit. But yeah, of course, there's this fear appeal, you know, that's what it's called, I think, in marketing, that always says, if you don't do this, something bad is coming your way. And when I first realized it, I came back on it. Like I jumped off last year in March, then I came back on it because I also had to promote my show at the museum and so on. But then when I realized it, I was like, so what? What, you know, will I really disappear if I'm not in there? Is because then a bigger question arises. If all our careers depend on these two social platforms, which belong to the same company, once the company is down, we're fucked. Sorry for the language, but if that's everything that my career depends on, then maybe I should cut it from the roots as soon as I can. I don't know. I hope nobody will hold me accountable if I come back on it next week. But you know, I think it's. There's this beautiful text, and I'm going to finish with this, sorry, by Bernard Stiegler, that is called, I think, To Love Me, to Love Us. And he talks about synchronization and hypersynchronization, and the thread that each day consuming the same type of content poses to our thinking, but also to our availability to love each other and to understand each other, not only emotionally, but also politically, you know. So I hope that in this sense, it gives me more freedom to listen to what others have to say, or to be curious about others when I don't have the feeling that I already know because I've seen it on an Insta story. I hope I will just be able to be as committed to the idea in the 1 year from now on as well.
Yeah, and perhaps that's one of the learnings of the pandemic situation, and trying to break your ways of living and try new new routines and ways of approaching life. Yeah, I think that is a quite nice way to finish this conversation, actually. And I want to say thank you so much for having this talk with me, and it was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much, and also for giving me a chance to dress up. I have so little of these occasions now.
Yeah, that's social media.
Yeah. Are there any questions on Facebook, or should we just?
I think we should. No, there are no questions.
Okay. Everything was very clear.
Yeah, it was so clear.
Yeah.
Yeah. No more questions. No, but let's also post the sound work, Espíritu Corps. Yeah. A link to that in the feed, and if there are more images or documentation that you felt we were missing out on. So.
Okay, I can make a package.
Yeah. A portfolio online. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.